Good morning.
All right, here we go, Chavra. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Dalid. We're going to go a little bit more. The Sugya is going to discuss a little bit more about the importance of having non-directive, non-positive speech. As we learned 2 stories yesterday, and as we will learn a 3rd story here on top of this. If there's something non-positive to share, do it in a wise way. In other words, do not do it directly. But things can be learned. We'll have various stories. You can derive a lot about the person from the way the person speaks. Now, we're going to learn that Midai Raisa, the Isur of Chametz begins Erev Pesach, Mishei Shois Ulamayla, which means from the beginning of the 7th hour. You only have until the middle of the day, Midai Raisa, to be allowed to consume Chametz. The Isur begins on the 2nd half of Erev Pesach. Shitas Rashi that we'll have on Pesachim Daf Daled, that is very much debated by many Rishonim, is that the Isur isn't only the Isur of Achila, Erev Pesach, but the Isur of Bal Yirah, Bal Yamatzah also begins Midoi Raisa, Erev Pesach, Sheishois, Ulamayla. We're going to have a lot about, if that's the case, then why didn't you do B'dikas Chametz? I don't know, 1 hour before that? In other words, if the Isur is only from the 7th hour, so do B'dikas Chametz in the beginning of the 6th hour, which is in plenty of time, the Gemara says, to do B'dika, and then to do Tashbisu, to eliminate the Chametz. We're going to be learning about Zrizin, Magdim, and Lemitzvahs. How far back do we use the Zrizin, Magdim, and Lemitzvahs? The source of Zrizin, Magdim, and Lemitzvahs, and as we will see, the most Zrizin demands of you is to go back to the early morning, never to the night prior. So why in the Mishnah do you have to be B'dika the night prior? We're going to have the 2 reasons in the Gemara. We're going to have various inquiries regarding upon whom is the obligation of B'dikas Chametz. Like, for example, when it comes to the mitzvah of mezuzah, who's obligated to put up the mezuzah? Not the balabas, not the one who owns the property, but the one who lives in the property. Upon whom is the chiyuv of B'dikas Chametz, particularly if a person is going to rent out a place on the 14th day during the day. Or the night prior, you didn't even lease it yet. Now you enter the property, but there is chametz there. The chametz is not yours. Upon whom is the obligation? We're going to see the concept that hakoil chaverim eitzel b'dikas chametz. Whom are you allowed to trust if they say that they made a b'dikas chametz? Can you trust people that normally you would not be halachically trusted as a witness? Or do we say that there's something unique about b'dikas chametz? As we'll see, b'dikas chametz is only midrabanan. That goes back to the first machlekes Rashi Tosfos that we'll go through again. And then maybe even those who otherwise would not have been trustworthy are. We're going to learn the principle that people are happy when their property is used for a mitzvah. This is a halachic concept. When you go to a shul today, and if you, for whatever reason, forgot your talis and tefillin, or if you're a bacher, your tefillin, and there's a tefillin laying around, you are allowed to use it without asking for permission, as long as you wrap it up properly. That's brought down all the way in the Gemara, because we'll see how this applies over here. And God willing, on the Avdalad Amud Beis, we're going to begin the discussion of where do you know from the Torah that indeed the Isur Chametz is Mishei Shois Ulamayla? Where do you know that? Read the Psukim. Maybe the Isur of Chametz only begins when Pesach begins. The Isur Malacha begins the night of the 15th. And we're going to begin and see that there are indeed many sources for that. Without any further ado, Chavre, Daf Daled, Pesachim Daf Daled, Mamash on the top of the Amid. Again, more on non-direct, non-positive speech. regarding the following story. Rav, the famous Rav, who was Bar Achua de Rab Chia, all right, Rav was the son of Rab Chia's brother. Now, Rab Chia's brother's name was Aivu. Rav's father's name was Aivu. Rav was also Ubar Achsei. Rav was the son of Rab Chia's sister. How can that be? So Rashi explains that Rab Chia's father, right, had a son Aivu from a different marriage. Rab Chia's mother had a daughter from a different marriage, which means that Aivu, her name was Ima, which means that Aivu and Ima were b'chlal not related. And they got married. And they had the schus of having Rav. The Kitzur, Rav's father was Rab Chia's half-brother. Rav's mother was Rab Chia's half-sister. Now, Kisalik Lahasam, Rav, as we all know, was the big Rosh Yeshiva in Surah. He once went back to Eretz Yisrael for a visit. There is where Rab Chia lived. Rab Chia did not know about whether his siblings, not his sister, not his brother, whether they're still living. And he asked that of Rav. And tragically, Rav did not have good news. So Amar Lei, so Rab Chia asked Rav, Aivu Kayam? Aivu is my half-brother. Is my brother alive? Is your father alive? So we're going to read the Gemara the way Rashi is goyres. So Amar Lei, this is the same topic. You don't say, no, he passed away. Be wiser. Amar Lei, so Rav says, what? Ima Kayemes. Ima was the name of his mother. Ima was the name of Rab Chia's sister. What, if you're asking about what do you know about my mother? Is my mother alive? Is your sister alive? Okay, so Hitaka asks, Amar Lei, Ima Kayemes. Is my sister, whose name was Ima, is she alive? So Amalei, to which Rav responds, what, Aivu Kayam? What, do you know if Aivu is alive? In other words, he never said no, but from the way he answered, by Dafka not answering, that's the way you speak. So Rab Chia understood by himself that not his half-brother, nor his half-sister are alive. So now we're going to go into, for a moment, this concept of a Shmua Kereva and a Shmua Rechaika. We should never know of these things. A Shmua Kereva means when someone becomes aware of that he or she are entering a period of Avelus because one of the 7 halachic relatives for whom you have to mourn, father, mother, brother, sister, spouse, son or daughter, any of them, God forbid, pass away, you have to sit Avelus. If you find out about it up until 30 days, that's called a Shmua Kereva, you found out about it, and all of the dinim of Avelus go into effect, it's going to be unusual because if you'll find out 3 weeks in, it's possible that the other family members already finish Shiva. You'll begin and do a proper, all the Dinei Avelos go into effect. Shmua Rechaika means you erst heard about it after 30 days. Now the topic, the sugya, the heart of the sugya of Avelos is in Moyed Katan, but here we're going to learn a certain detail. He found out about it, it was clear way beyond 30 days after his brother and after his sister passed away. Now a person has to mourn for both of them. It's not as chomer as for a parent. For a parent, the person has to mourn for a whole year. For a brother and a sister, you have Avelos for 30 days, but you have to sit Shiva. Then there's the Shloishim. So Amar Lei L'Shamoy, Rab Chia told his attendant, Chaloitz limin alai, please take off my shoes, which is one of the things that an Aval has to do. Now there's another, perhaps even more external, clear way of expressing our grief, and that is renting Kriya, ripping Kriya. So there's a whole discussion from our Gemara. Again, the sugi is in Moed Katan. It appears that he didn't rip Kriya. The way he showed that the action of mourning was having his shoes removed. And the Ran and many other Rishonim say that indeed, for all of the other Kerevim, other than a father and a mother, if there is a Shmua Rechaika, then you don't rent Kriya. That was for Rab Chia, it was his brother and it was a sister. But the Ran holds that you can't prove over here that if a person has a Shmua Rechaika for a father or for a mother, God forbid, there you do rip Kriya. But anyways, so first of all, he right away entered mourning by having his shoes removed. But then he says, he asked his attendant to take his clothing, whatever it is that he needed to take with him when he went to a bathhouse. Bathing is something that one may not do when one is in mourning. So, and he was going that day. That means he mourned a little bit. So says the Gemara, Shmamino, from here we learn from that, from the way that Chia reacted, we can learn Talas 3 halachis. Shmamino, we learned that Avol Asur ben Ilas Asandal, that a mourner is Asur in having his shoes on. Shmamino, we also see from over here that Shmuar Chaika, that a delayed report, which is what happened over here, delayed meaning that he found out of the passing 30 days or more after they passed away. And not only is it only noik for one day, but as we have this din in Avelus and in other dinim as well, that mixas hayom kakuloi. So he only actually needed to be in a state of Avelus for a short period of time. So he had his shoes removed, and then he went to the bathhouse, and that was the way he went out of his Avelus. Mixas hayom kakuloi. The story is brought in here to show you how we have an Ashkafta, the Rebbe in Ksubas, Daf Kuv Gimel Kuv Dalid, when Rebbe passed away, how people were very careful not to share Berachel Bitchaktana, the not positive news. Weiter. This is going to be more, not about non-positive news, but Bechlal, from the way a person speaks, you can derive a lot about that person. Hahuda Amr, there was a person that always said, Dunu Dini. He was always eager to go to Beis Din. Whenever he had some sort of misunderstanding, he said, let's go to Beis Din. In other words, he would never yield unless there would be an actual Beis Din that would tell him so. And that's something very unusual. So Amri, so the people said, Shma mina migdan ka'asi. Something so unusual, he must come from the tribe of Dan. Regarding Dan, it says, recording a pasuk in Vayichi, Dan yadin amaki achad shifte Yisrael, and he's always running to a din. He calms himself from the shevet of Dan. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu malkeinu shakol yivdoni. Another story. Hahu dahava ka'azal v'amar. There was a person that would always go around saying, akef yama asisnei bira. I would love to build a palace on the seashore. I want to build a beach house. So Batko, they looked into his yichus and they found out that it came from the tribe of Zvulun, because it says regarding Zvulun that Zvulun l'chayf yamim yishka, and also from Yaakov's bracha to his child and to their descendants, that they shall dwell on the seashore. The Ben Yehoyada makes a very good observation that the first person, the Gemara doesn't say that Batku that he comes from Sheva Dan. It says that he was from Sheva Dan. By this one, they had to do a bedika, because it's a lot more unusual for a person to run to a din Torah. That was clear. It's always going to a din Torah. And Masha'inkin having wanting to have a house on the beach, we can all relate to that. Why Favosnish? It's very nice, the beach. If you like the beach, it's nice to have a house on the beach. But still, they looked into it and they found out that it came from Shevet Zvulun. Okay. So Chevra, that ends the whole sugya of Lashon Ikiyah versus the Lashon Ketzara. And now we're coming back to the beginning of the Mishnah, not to the word oir, but let's start getting into the din. Says the Gemara, now that we established, Dulukula Alma. Bein l'Rav Huna, Bein l'Rav Yehuda. The Mishnah says oir means urtahu. It's night. In the night, going into the 14th, we have to make b'dikas chametz. So michti, behold, frek the Gemara, Bein l'Rabbi Yehuda, or Bein l'Rabbi Meir, as we will learn their machlokas and daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis regarding from how early on is chametz prohibited. They don't debate the din doiraisa. They debate the din derabanan, because the Rabbanan, they made a geder. That means if we would eat the chametz up until the biblical zman, especially then they had no watches, they can make a mistake and think it's not yet midday, and maybe it is midday. So whether you have to move it back 1 hour, whether you have to move it back 2 hours, we'll learn a lot about this machlokes. Nevertheless, everyone agrees chametz einay asad ela misheish sho'os ulamayla. Sho'os ulamayla means that you can eat it during the entire of the 6th hour. It becomes prohibited when you enter the 7th hour. Midoiraisa. So frek the Gemara v'nivdik b'shis. So what would be wrong, right? Make a b'dikas chametz 1 hour before it's asur to eat it. Like Rashi says, in 1 hour it's enough for you to find it and for you to do tashbisu, to eliminate it. However you eliminate it, another big machlokes, whether tashbisu is dafka through burning it, whether any sort of elimination, feeding it to your dog, putting it into the sea. Why do you have to do it the night before? And if you're going to say, because reason magdim el mitzvahs, you're right. Really, you have to do bedika to get rid of it. It would have been enough 1 hour before, but reason magdim el mitzvahs, that's a klal. That the zealous are early to perform a mitzvah, says the Gemara. No, if that would have been the reason, in order to properly abide by this reason, nibdoik mitzafra, making a bedika from the morning, which was the havamin of what we thought Rav Huna meant. That's already called zrizin. Zrizin never demands of you to go back more than the morning. And how do I know?
Rabbi,
Regarding
sorry,
this,
Rabbi, how do you calculate the 6 hours? From where? Where is that? From what time?
6 a.m. From 6 a.m. We'll learn that later. From the morning, let's presume, especially spring and fall, in the the days are more or less 12 hours. The nights are more or less 12 hours. So the first 6 hours of the day, mamash, divide the day in half. Divide the daytime hours into half. We're going to learn a lot about it. Okay, let's come back over here. So if it's because of zrizin, only go back to the tzafra. How do I know that zrizin never demands of you going back in the morning? Guys, it's not exactly from bris. Don't forget that mitzvah of doing a bris milah biblically is only from the day of. But hold on. It says, the right tazriya, and we learned in the Braisa that God wants it to happen during the daytime hours of the 8th day. When during that day, v'tanya kolayim kulei kasher l'milah. Elo, you should know that zrizin magdim el mitzvahs. Again, we're not comparing this to a bris, but what we are over there. Why do we say zrizin magdim el mitzvahs? That do the bris the earliest opportunity that you could. Parenthetically, there was sometimes also a competing value. And the competing value is B'roiv Am Hadras Melech. That's another topic. And our Rebbe is strongly of the opinion by Bris, like if you have to pick and choose, B'roiv Am Hadras Melech is better than the value of Zrizin Magdim El Mitzvahs. That's why de facto many people do a Bris a little bit later when they know that more people will come. But show that the concept of Zrizin, the Braisa says, is learned from where? Oh, that's the source. Because it says, Vayashkem Avraham Baboiker. And as Tosfos very importantly points out, there are 2 times it says Vayashkem Avram Aboiker. Vayashkem Avram Aboiker, Tosfos, the second Tosfos, is once when he went to ask of Hashem not to destroy Sodom. And there, he didn't go at night prior. Fakert, we learned that a person should not go out alone by night, and he went by himself. Nothing can be proved from there. Maybe he would have gone at night, but he didn't want to walk alone at night. The Vayashkem Avram Aboiker that we're quoting here is from the Akedah. There, Avram Avinu went, and when you go with 2 other people, you have nothing to be feared about them. There's no worry about the mazikin. So if Avram Avinu was eager to fulfill God's will, why didn't he go the night prior? That's the source that even when you do something as early as you could, it doesn't demand of you to go beyond earlier than the morning. So that's the kasha over here. Since that's the source of Zrizin, Avram Avinu could have gone the night before. So over here, why are we boydek at night? These are very important gemaras. Amarav Nachman by Yitzchak. Let's learn this properly. There are 2 answers. There are 2 reasons, and a lot in yeshiva. Why we need 2 reasons? But this he's saying 2 things. Number 1, a practical reason. Men, chevre, we are working people, and a working person gets up early in the morning and he goes to work. You go to shul, you go to work. So people are not home early in the morning. They're out there and davening, learning, and they're going to work. People work until when it gets dark. When are people at home? At night. So it's a practical reason. There's an obligation to do the tashbisu. For that, you have to make a bedika. So do it when people are home. Answer number 1. Answer number 2 is a halachic answer. And that is, as we will learn later, the source that bedikas chametz should be done l'oid haner. We'll learn that later. But let's take that as a premise. Since you have to use a candlelight is a lot more effective when it's dark versus when there is natural light. Then the candlelight is a lot less effective. That since it's called v'oid haner yafal abedika. 2 reasons.
If a person is not at work for 6 hours
so Rabbi Chen is asking that since we will learn that people are not allowed to work from the second half of the day, that's midrabanan, which means people are going to be home. So why don't you do the bedika over there? So a few things. First of all, people are not allowed to work midrabanan from the 7th hour. Earlier, there are places that there is a minig. We'll learn that later, that people didn't work from the morning, but that's only those mokaimas. The other places, fakert, when you have a short day work, I think, and people have work to do with the God with help, you work until the end. Doing it at night, the thing is, you're not working, you're calm. So Amar Abaya says Abai Hilkach, therefore, since it's not because of Zrizin, no, It's because of these two concepts. So now, if you have a young Talmud Chacham, and it means from a Yid, a God-fearing person, a chassid, Idnei means people have appointed times to learn Torah. When they have a chavrusa and they have a group and they learn be'iyun, don't open up an appointed session of learning. Be'urta de tleisa de nagi arbesa. The night, just to spell it out, the night, what we call b'dikas chametz night, at the end of the 13th day, going into the 14th day. Why not? Because might say, because he might extend, you might get involved in your learning. And you will not do the mitzvah properly. Had the reason of doing b'dikas chametz, reason magdim mitzvahs, we would never have such a, we would never said you can't learn. Okay, reason magdim mitzvahs is a value. Learning Torah is also a value. The Isra is only Erev Pesach during the day, Midrash in the middle of the day. So nish gefährlich. Even if you'll end up learning the whole night, oichet nish gefährlich, if it would have been because of Zrizim. But we're saying, no, it's not because of Zrizim. People in the day, they go to work. They're not going to do a good bedika. During the day, there's outside daylight. The oir haneid is not good anymore, as good as. So now you have to do it in the beginning of the night. So therefore, don't sit down and begin a established learning session. This detail is important because to chap a little halacha, many people today, because of technology, they're always listening to Torah. That's okay. It means don't sit down in a way where we know that in such a sitting, we can get involved and we're going to lose our sense of time. Now we're beginning with various inquiries that are moedidik. They will shed light as to upon whom is the obligation of b'dikas chametz. Boy minei mirav Nachman bar Yitzchak. That's the first boya. Hamaskir ba'is lechaveiroi be'arba asa. If you rent a house on the 14th day, daytime, we just established that the chiyuv begins the night before al mi livdoi, upon whom is the obligation to do b'dikas chametz. Either do we say ala maskir livdoi, the obligation is on the landlord. Why pashat? The chamira didehu, because the chametz is his. And even when you leased it, you can still argue you did not want to lease. You leased a home. It's not your chametz. Maybe it's on the seicher. It's on the tenant because the isura b'rishusei koye, because the chametz will be in your domain. Now we did speak out as all the achronim, all of them over here, that when we learned the first machlekes Rashi Tosfos, and we explained that Rashi says in the Mishnah bedika is not to be over about Aliyah. Tosfos says you do bedika dilma asi lemechla. You might eat it. So we spoke out that this nafkamina. Can you have someone else's chametz laying around in your house? If it's for you not to be over about Aliyah, as we will learn very shortly, the isur Aliyah is you may not own your chametz. It's not your chametz. If the reason is because you might erroneously eat it, you might eat it. Even if it's someone else's chametz, I'm not allowed to eat someone else's chametz. Side of stealing, I'm also eating chametz. The reason why that does not go into play, they all explain, is because the machlekes between Rashi and Tosfos is, why did they tell you to do bedika? Why? But once they said bedika has to be done, we have to know upon whom did Chazal say you have to do it? Upon whom? And in this case, it doesn't have to go together. Many times it's that way. There's the reason what initiated their takana, but then you have to know they were masakin. In this case, upon whom were they masakin the bedika? That's the first question. And the Gemara says, we know, Tashima. And we're quoting a Braisa. Hamaskir bais l'chaveroi says, al hasoicher lasois mezuzah. Mezuzah, chiyuv mezuzah is on the tenant. And therefore the Gemara is in the Havamina comparing the chiyuv was b'chlal not on the landlord. So the Gemara says, no. Hassan over there, Omar, Rav Mesharshia, the rule that mezuzah chayves hadari, the mezuzah is the obligation of the resident. Over here, we have to read Rashi. And we all remember the first Rashi. Rashi says, V'dikas chametz is not to be given a bali matzah. We also read the Ran, which is Gavaldik. The Ran says that Rashi knows that you can do bitul. But midoiraisa, you can either do bedika, either you can do bitul. So when the Mishnah says you do bedika, if you would not have done bitul, then bedika is midoiraisa. But even the Rashi is moida that if you did bitul, then doing bedika, which we have to do nonetheless, is only midrabanan. That's the Rashi over here. 4 lines under the Gemara, the middle of the Rashi. Hachi mai says Rashi abel hacha. Bedikas chametz is derabanan. Mezuzah is a chiyuv doiraisa. God says the chiyuv is on the one who lives there. Here it's a derabanan. The mishum baliro bal yematzeh. Rashi says here what Tosfos says in the beginning. Ha'amar lekamon. We're going to learn in the Gemara the sagi lebe bittul ba'alma. Bittul covers the balira ba'yamotz. Imasiach date minei, which means you have to completely take your mind off it. And here are the words of Rashi that we quoted that in the first daf. That Rashi's understanding of bittul is it's not your normal hefker. The words of ka'afra da'ara is Rashi. Umash v'le ka'afra. And v'amar kol chamira the bebeso hadein. Elomar v'ayten anashi v'rabbanan hu de atzruch b'dika. The Rabbanan obligated you. V'hashta, that's the kasha, that's the boya. Ki haygavna mi boyalon toirach ze al mi mutal. Upon whom is the obligation to have the tircha? I'm calling it tircha because biblically I'm covered. I did bittul. I have to, on top of that, do badika. Maybe it's even though that I live here, I'm the tenant, but to you, the balabas, it's your chametz, you have to trouble yourself. So that's the question. Back inside the Gemara. So Amar Luhur Rav Nachman by Yitzchak Tanina, I have a explicit braisa. Hamaskel bais lechaveirei. Now we're going to learn Milsa agav urcha l'shitas Rashi psanaya kinyan. Bottom line, the braisa is going to tell you we need to know who had balabatishkeit over this home, over this apartment, when the zman of the chiyuv of bedika, which is the night going in, when that happened. Who was the owner, a tenant is also the owner, of that locale, the night of bedikas chametz. Now, if you are in middle of leasing an apartment, the kinyan that we are referring to here, Rashi holds, the kinyan is when the owner gives you the keys. When you get the keys of your house, of your apartment, now legally, halachically, legally, you're the balabas. So it says in the Braisa, in other words, if the 14th arrived before the landlord handed over the keys, bisman chalois chiyuv b'dikas chametz, who was there? The landlord. Even though now you, the tenant, you're in there. No, the landlord has to go and has to be toireach to do it. Al hamasker livdoik. But if the tenant got the keys, that means that he now halachically he's now the balabas before the zman of the dikas chametz. Now ala soicha livdoik, even though the chametz is not his. Even though the chametz is not his. Now one boy is based on the other. Now that we established it, now it's correct to say that if you lease an apartment on the day of the 14th, you have the right to presume that the house was already geboidikt, because the chiyuv, as we said, is chal on whoever owns that house when the zman chiyuv comes. So you are allowed to make that presumption. So now, next kasha. Can you, based on this concept of a chazaka, can I presume, me the tenant, since we already established that even though the landlord knew he's not going to be their Pesach, but now that we established it doesn't matter. He owned it. I didn't take the keys yet. He had to do it. Can I presume that it was done? Can I rely on a chazaka not even to need? Now, when you have a doubt, the rule normally is we rely on chazaka, we rely on roiv, we rely on umdanas if you have no other way to find out. So right away, it's like, why do you have to rely on a chazaka? Why didn't you ask him? We'll get to that in a moment. But when you can't ask him, can you rely? Is there such a chazaka? Do we say cheskasei badog? Oy, ein cheskasei badog. And right away, the Gemara counters, lamai nafkemina. Lamai nafkemina. Lishayle, versteinish. And that's a very important klal. All of the dinim, like we just mentioned, halachic tools are needed when you don't have how to find out the mitzias, because you can't. So the Gemara clarifies, the boya that they asked of Rav Nachman by Yitzchak indeed is the leisei lahai de lishayulei. The landlord is not here. You don't have a text, you don't have the technology, you can't get hold of him. So the question is, la'atruche lahai mai. Does the tenant have to be matriach himself based on what we just learned, that since bisman chalois hachiyuv, it was under the balabatishkeit of the landlord, and he was mechuyev to do bedikas chametz, even though he knew he won't be there. So maybe that in itself, okay, I can rely that he did it. So this also tinisua nacha braisa. It says in the braisa, hakoil ne'emanim, all are believed. Al biur chametz, concerning biur chametz. Biur chametz begins with bedikas chametz. For you to eliminate the chametz, you have to look for it. Who is hakoil? Who does that include? Says the Braisa, afilu noshim, even women, afilu avodim, afilu ketanim. We believe them when they say that this house was examined, was searched for chametz. And the question is, my kama mehemne, why do we believe them? We're asking on the Braisa, like look inside the Rashi before you turn. 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid. My kama nemanim, hol lav b'nei asudaninu. Normally, they're not halachically trustworthy people. Upa, stop. Why are they not trustworthy? What, a woman? Eid echad nemen b'yisurin. What are you talking about? When you go into anyone's kitchen, how can you eat their food? So before we go in Rashi, we're going to go a little jump ahead, turn over to the Daled Amid Beis, look inside the 3rd Tosfos, in middle of the Tosfos, 2 lines under the Gemara, the very famous words, with a lot of debate in Achronim whether they apply today halachically. I'm reading inside the 3rd Tosfos, Divrei HaMaschil Heimenuhu Rabbanan B'Drabanan, 2 lines under the Gemara. Mikamokim says Tosfos, I have a midoi raisa. Had B'dikas Chametz been midoi raisa, again, we just established, even according to Rashi, everyone is moided that if you do bittul, which you have to do, then B'dikas Chametz is only midrabanan. If it would have been midoi raisa, loy mehemninan law. Why? Women are bona fide, trustworthy by Yisurin, the Kedinim. There are aid echad nemen b'Yisurin includes a woman. Bishum de'ika tircha yeseirasa, because B'dikas Chametz is unique. It demands a lot of tircha. V'tzadek digdu gadol kedemuchach b'iru yishalmi shemefaresh mepnei shenashim atzloniyas hein. Okay, and then this concept of nashim atzloniyas, just to know, there's a debate in halacha l'maisa whether we apply this today or not.
Rabbi, what's the translation of the word atzloniyas?
You need it for the whole word to hail. They're lazy. You're happy now, Danny. Good. All right. Now coming back to Daf Dalid Amud Aleph. So Nachal, just to get the flow over here, that they're going to fire us one of these days. That Nachal, so he brings up Braisa. The Braisa says that we believe even Nashim Yamiktanim. And the premise is really, like Tosfos says, they have no nemanos. So really what the Braisa is saying, we don't need to trust them. There's a chazaka that it's done. That's why you can trust them. That's l'chayr is right. And my tama mehemna, why do we trust them? Now let's turn to the Daled Amid Beis in the Gemara. Is it not because we don't need their testimony? Lav mishum the cheskasoi baduk, that you can presume that it was already geboidikt. Why? Because the kosavar hakoil chaverim heim eitzel b'dikas chametz. These are beautiful words. But we have different labels that we try to avoid, but you have halachic labels. So you have the am haaretz, which are people that because of their lack of knowledge, there's also a diminution in their observance in certain areas of halacha. And then you have a chaver, or in plural chaverim. That means a chaver, a friend, but it refers to people that are more meticulous. Particularly, this is used when it comes to dinim of tumantara, when it comes to dinim of separating trumas u'maisres. But we are using this term here regarding b'dikas chametz, that everyone is a chaver. Everyone is careful. B'dikas chametz, everyone is going to do. Hakoil chaverim eitzel b'dikas chametz. Like Rashi writes in the top, even otherwise, someone who's categorized as a am haaretz, ubadavar shehu musik chaver. Anyone who is halachically called a chaver, you can rely that they did it. Like the Tanya, like we learned back in the Gemara, the 2nd line from the top, chaver shemeis v'hiniach megurim alei peres, and he leaves a storehouse full of produce. And when it comes to the obligation of separating trumas u'maisres, the obligation is only chal. It only goes into effect when you finish that product. If you're selling it, you have to put it into a pile, and you have to do the meruach, you have to smooth the pile. So there was a yid that had his pile smoothed hayoim, and sadly he passed away today. You can presume that he separated trumas u'maisres because of a rule that people separate trumas u'maisres. Afilu hein b'nei yoiman, even if the meruach was done today, hadei hein b'cheskas misukanim. Again, if you can ask him, ask him. But if you can't ask him, you can presume that, because whenever someone has a status of a chaver, we mamish rely on them. So Rav Nachman is trying to prove from this braisa, can be that you believe them. It means that you don't need their testimony because hakol chaverim. So therefore, coming back to our boya, based on what we established before, that whoever was the owner of that location during the beginning of the time of chiyuv b'dikas chametz, upon that person is the chiyuv to do b'dika. Now add on that hakoil chaverim eitzel b'dikas chametz. So therefore, if you can find, you're the tenant, if you can find the landlord, ask him. If you can't find it, you don't even have to do it. Says the Gemara, no. Umimai, that's not what the Braisa means. Dilma shiny yache, no, dafka. Don't forget, the Braisa says the words that you believe them. Believing them means that without their testimony, you don't know. Punkt verkehrt. You can rely on them because they're testifying. Dilma shiny yache mishum de kamri hani. So the Gemara says, well, that can't be. Atu amiro dahani midi mishasha isbei. There's any mamashas to their testimony, like we just read out on the Tosfos, right? By Yechiyav D'Oraisa, Tosfos says, where you have a tircha yiseirasa, where you need a big digduk because of this klal of neshamot slanias, you can't trust them. So the Gemara says, well, okay, let's count. So elamai de chaskasei baduk, elamai de chaskasei baduk. Hi, hakoil nemanim. Where you're telling me, okay, so because of that, yeah, you can insist. We don't need their testimony. There's a chazaka. So the Gemara says that can't be, because the Braisa said everyone is nemanim, even nashim, even avadim, even ketanim. The Braisa should not have said that. The Braisa should have said, koil habatim becheskas bedukin ba'arba asam miboyele. So it must be that we do. It's because there's nemanus, which means fakert, that if not for their testimony, there is no chazaka that it's baduk. So the Gemara says, Elamai, what's the other side? Mishum amira dahani. That dafka, you need to have their testimony, which does imply ha loy amri hani loy. You may never presume that a house was gebaidik fakert without at least the isha katan testifying. So maybe the Gemara is suggesting this Braisa should also resolve the inquiry, but not the way that Nachman Bar Yitzchak wanted to resolve it, but in the opposite direction. The fact that you need to have their nemanus, that means they have to testify, that implies tifshat minei, the ein cheskasi baduk. And coming back to our place, so when you rent a house and you get the keys on the 14th, if you can't find the landlord, even though he should have, you dafka may not rely on that chazaka. So again, we can use this braisa, but to resolve the inquiry the opposite way than Rabbi Yitzchak wanted. But let us at least resolve it. We refuted his attempt to his direction, but could we resolve it in the opposite direction? So the Gemara says, this also not. Loy, lo'olam, eimalach, I'll tell you that normally, cheskasei baduk, this does not mean that for sure it's that way. Maybe it's that way. This is going to be a way that's not resolved. Why do you need to have the nashim, avadim, and katanim to testify? Because the Braisa maybe is speaking about a unique case. What's the unique case? The muchzik lan the loy badak. We know, not because there are witnesses, but there's a chazaka that the landlord did not do bedika. Says Rashi, it's more or less on the same height of the Gemara, 2 lines down. Kigoin the muchzak lan b'hai the lebadak kigoin shero'inuhu tarud. We saw him extremely preoccupied the night of bedikas chametz. Many people saw him and he was busy. We have people that tell us that we have witnesses that are telling us that the landlord was not here on the time of bedikas chametz. Now we're going to learn dinim about this as well. When you travel, especially within 30 days of Pesach, you're going to do bedikas chametz, but it's different. Maybe if the person would have been here in the city, maybe we could have a chazaka that since the chiyuv is taka on the landlord, he went and he did it. But what's going to happen if you have a chazak on one hand, but there's other circumstances that, so to say, equalize, they nullify, they cancel out, they balance out the chazaka. He was tarut, and you know that. That maybe is the only case of the Braisa. Now let's go back inside. The muchzak lan delay badak. And the ka'amrihani, but now come along the nashim avadim and ketanim, and they say, batkine, we searched it. So now, maybe they should not have nemanus. Kumash Malan, the Braisa tells us that only because, since even the bedikas chametz is midrabanan, we're always going to fall back to that. Why is bedikas chametz midrabanan? Because the midah ayraisa bebitel ba'al masagi. And yes, once you made bitel, so you don't own it. If it's not yours, midah ayraisa, you're good to go. It's only that the Chachamim came along and they said that even though you were mevatalid, you still have to do b'dikas chametz. Let's just quote the first Tosfos, because since loy badul inish minei, and to attack appreciate that. What's all the other machala? If a person has in their house treif, they shouldn't have it in their house, but we're not afraid they're going to eat it because we never eat treif. But when it comes to chametz, that's unique. Chametz in the whole year is allowed to be. You're allowed to eat it, so you're habituated in eating it. So a punkt now, the Torah says it's an isur, but only for a certain amount of time. Here, there's a much greater fear that if you're going to have it be'en, even though you were mavatalid, dilma aseh lamechle. But that's a fear that the Chachamim came with. The Chachamim were the ones that said that even though you did bittul, you have to do b'dikam. So here's where the Gemara says, perhaps what the Rabbi is saying, since it's only a derabanan, hemenuhu rabanan b'derabanan. And now Nachman just a chazer the Tosfos. Now Tosfos wants to point out that in other areas we don't need for something to only be a derabanan to give a woman namanus. Eid echanem b'isurim, the whole kashrus you eat in your house. Eid echanem b'isurim. But as we mentioned, since there's something unique about the dikas chametz here, if not for it being a derabanan, we would not give them namanus. And maybe that's what the Brais is saying. It's a maybe this. In other words, the point of the Gemara is that just like Rav Nachman by Yitzchak cannot prove from this Braisa that there is a halachic chazaka which allows me to presume when I can't inquire and find out that the house was already gebaidik. No, you can't prove it from me. You neither can prove the opposite as well. You can't prove over here that there is no such chazaka because maybe the Braisa is speaking about a unique case. So the first bayah we resolved and the second one remains open. Now, my friends, by the two dot, we are starting a unbelievable sugya.
Rabbi,
yes.
So Lamaskana, do we say that by bdikas chametz we do treat the owner as a chaver, or was that not settled?
In the Gemara, it's not resolved. In the Gemara, it's not resolved. It's a bayit. Okay. Now, Tanan Hassan, we will learn that there is a machlokes, like we just quoted today on Daf Daled Amud Aleph. Everyone holds that Mida Oiraisa. I didn't read the Rashi inside, but I quoted it in the introduction. The Isur of Chametz is from Erev Pesach, Mishei Shois Ulamayla, meaning from the end of the 6th hour, from the beginning of the 7th hour. Rashi and Daled Amud Aleph writes clearly. I just want to go back. I'm going back to the Abdallah because this is the Rashi that people debate with, and then we have the Rambam, and then there's a machlokes. Does the Rambam agree? Does the Rambam disagree? Rambam writes that the Abu Rabbanan Lido Oiraisa, right? The Chachamim made a harchaka, which is what we're going to learn right now. Chametz eino asur min haTorah bebal yiro uba achila ela meshei shois. Midoiraisa, the Isur, doesn't only refer to the Isur Achila, it refers to the Isur of not even owning it. Begins, Meshei Shois Ulamayla. However, the Chachamim made a harchaka. And let's begin learning, quoting that Mishnah. So we will have this Mishnah soon on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Rav Meir Oimer, he is of the opinion, Oichlin Kol Chamesh, V'soifrim Etchilas Sheish. So says Rashi, 3 lines under the Gemara, V'soifrim Etchilas Sheish. The harchaka of Rav Meir, which is not as large, it's not as great as the harchaka of Rabbi Yehuda, is at least for 1 hour prior to the biblical time when you can't eat it, don't eat it then as well. And that's why don't burn it in the beginning of the 7th hour. No, burn it in the beginning of the 6th hour. Because of the rule, Lefisha Adam Toya B'Sha'us. Or you have in the emendation in the Messiah Sashas, Lefisha Adam Toya B'Sha'ah, because stuck in 1 hour. A person might miscalculate the time by an hour. You don't have watches, you're looking at where the sun is in the sky. If you're gonna eat until the last moment, at least midrabanan, give yourself, that's Rabbi Meir, 1 hour. So you can eat during the 5th hour. You may not eat during the 6th hour, and that's a midrabanan, because again, midoiraisa, the isur, lerashi, achila and balira begins with chila sheva. Rabbi Yehuda is a bit more machmer. Guys, we follow Rabbi Yehuda, we're familiar with this. Rabbi Yehuda says that oichlin only kol arba. You can eat up until the end of the 4th. When it comes to not eating chametz, we don't add the harchak of 1 hour, you add the harchak of 2 hours. Elamah, you don't have to burn it. The toilin kol chamesh, but during that 5th hour, you no longer can eat it, but you don't have to burn it as well. Toilin is an expression that's used not only when it comes to chametz. Toilin literally means leave it hanging. Hanging means nishtahed or nishtahin. You're not in the heavens, you're not on the earth. It means you're not allowed to eat it, but you don't need to burn it. We burn it in the last hour before the doiraisa. And if you don't have to burn it, that also means you could have hana'ah. You can feed it to your dog. You can make benefit of it. You can't eat it. But the sarfin, when do you burn it? Like Rabbi Meir, you burn it b'tchila sheish. Okay, so even the Gemara just is beginning by making it clear that midrabanan we extended back 1 hour Isur Achila. We extended Isur Achila back 2 hours, but it's being extended back from the biblical Zman, which is from the middle of the day. The first half of the daytime, you're allowed to eat chametz, and according to Rashi, you're not oiver bal yiro bal yamatzah. And then on the second half of the day, midoiraisa, you are violating, God forbid, if you eat chametz, and you are violating bal yiro bal yamatzah. Question is, where do we know that from? It was the kula alma miu chamesh meishei shois ulamaila is asur doiraisa. The isur begins right from the end of the 6th hour, which means from the beginning of the 7th hour. The question we have here is mi nalon, and the answer will be many. Just to make everyone clear that we're going to go all the way to the bottom of Daf Hey. We're going to have many different approaches. We're starting here with an abaya, but we will see later that we have from Braises, there's a whole opinions. There have many opinions from the Tanoim as to Minolan. So let's start with the first. Abai says like this, that today Kroik Sivi, and both of the psukim that we are quoting here is from Parshas Boy. It says, Shivas Yomim So'oir. So'oir in English means leaven. So'oir means chametz. That so'oir lo yematzeh bibotechem. Chametz may not be found for 7 days. You know what that means, my friends? It means that it may not be found even for one moment during any time of the 7 days. That means that when the 7 days begin, you already cannot have the chametz. In no part of the 7 days can you have the chametz. But Abaya says, it says in another pasuk, Ach, bayoim harishon, right? Ach, on the first day, tashbisu so'ar mibotechem. You should eliminate the chametz. What is that pasuk implying when you read it superficially? That you can do your act of elimination on the first day. But I got a problem. The moment I'm doing my tashbisu on the first day, that would also mean that there is that moment right before I eliminated it where I owned chametz in my reshus. These two verses contradict themselves. Remember that? You have something very similar when it comes to the creation, right? That God rest. We say this by Kiddush. That God finished on the 7th day. Finishing on the 7th day means that Epis was done on the 7th. He finished on the 7th. Then it says that he rested on the 7th. That's the same concept. There we gave the answer that no, God worked up until the last second. So it appeared to us as if he went into. But it was he only the Oibishter that knows how to be Mechav and Shois can end exactly at the boundary. We're not God. We don't know how to do that precision. So there's a contradiction. Is it that no time of the 7 days can you have Sa'ir, or can you get rid of it on the first day? So it must be that Ach by Yom HaRishon, the Yom HaRishon doesn't mean on the first day of Pesach. The Yom HaRishon is referring to Erev Pesach. HaKetzat l'Rabbis arba'a asar l'biur. Givaldik. Look inside Rashi, 5 lines on the bottom of the Amid. HaKetzat l'Rabbis, the Al-Karchach, Abaya says, that the pasuk of Ach Bayoim Harishon, the word Harishon does not mean the first day of, but it means the day prior to the first. Rishon Koidem L'Chal Shiva Ka'ama. What day is the day prior to the 7 days of Pesach? The 14th day of Nisan. Gemara is not happy. Why don't we say that Ema L'Rabbis Leile Chamisha Asar L'Bir? Why don't we say that, yeah, of course, you may not have any chametz during Shivas Yamim. Maybe Yamim means daytime. So during the 7 daytimes, you can't have any chametz. You have to eliminate it the night of Pesach itself. You're good. The Bayoim Harishon can mean the first day of Pesach, but it can refer to the beginning. The Salkadai Tachamina, as Abai is countering, that maybe the word Yomim Ksiv, the Shivas Yomim, which means Yomim in, days yes means days no. It means that you may not have chametz during the daytimes, but maybe the Isur of Bal Yematzeh does not apply to the nights. And if that would have been the meaning, so now the Torah writes the other pasuk, Ach Bayoim Harishon, right, Komash Malan, that Ach Bayoim Harishon means that you have to burn it right away when the night begins. But you see, you resolve the contradiction. Because what was the contradiction? That how can the God say you can't find chametz in your property during the entirety of the 7 days? If you are burning it in the beginning of the first, then you have it. The answer is no. God meant Bal Yematzeh during the daytime. And maybe the Ach Bayom Harishon means to burn it the night of Pesach, Oir L'chamisha Asar. So the Gemara says, no, we can't use the pasuk Ach. We don't need the pasuk Ach Bayom Harishon to teach us that din. Hahu lo yitzrach alei. We don't need the pasuk of Ach Bayom Harishon to tell you that you have to burn the chametz in the beginning of the 15th. Why not? Turning to Daf Hey, because that I would know by myself. You're right that when it says Shivas Yomim So'or Lo Yematzeh B'Vatechem, a person might have interpreted that pasuk to mean that during the daytimes of Pesach you may not have any chametz. But I anyways would have known that you have to burn it the night going into it, and therefore, as we'll see, the pasuk Ach Bayom Harishon is adding something. But how would I have known it? Gavaldik. So Abaya says because the Ha'iskash Hashbasa So'or, that hashbasa, again, the word tashbisu means to eliminate. People say it means to burn. That's really going into a machlokes that we don't want to talk about right now. That there is a hekesh between the obligation, the positive obligation of eliminating leaven, which means really chametz, to the prohibition of eating chametz. There is another hekesh between the prohibition of eating chametz to the mitzvah of eating matzah. They are all compared one to the other. And where do we find that? What do we learn with that? We'll see in a moment. But where do we find the hekesh? Says the Gemara, says Abai, Hashbasa so'or la'achilas chametz dichsiv. In the pasuk it says, Shivas yomim so'or lo yematzeh b'votechem. And it says in the continuation of this verse, Ki chol oichel machmetzes, whoever eats chametz v'nichraso. Okay, so you have to eliminate it at the time where you're not allowed to eat it. The isur of eating chametz, right, is compared to, there is a hekesh, to the mitzvah of eating matzah, as it says, kol machmetzes lo yisochelu b'chol moishvei kama, and then it says, b'chol moishvei seichem toichlu matzahs. Okay, so now that we established the hekesh, now Abaye says, beautiful, very simple. Since they are all connected one to the other, when is one obligated to eat matzah? That's also a explicit pasuk. We are obligated to eat matzah the night of the 15th. Actually, as we'll learn throughout these sugyas, there is no mitzvah to eat matzah for the remaining of Pesach. If you want to eat grain, then it cannot be chametzdik. But there is a mitzvah of eating matzah on the night of the 15th. And now in Galus, now it's minig Avzenu b'Yodeinu for both nights. Since the Torah says Abaye uksiv b'matzah ba'erev toichlu matzos. So Abaye is now saying the following from the pasuk Shivas Yomim So'or. I would clearly know that when the daytime of the 15th comes, you already must have gotten rid of your chametz. You can't eat it. You made bedika, you made biur, because you can't own it during any times of the day. Fine. Even if the Torah would not have written Ach Bayom Harishon Tashbisu, without that pasuk, I on my own, because of these hakeshim, would have known that minimally you have to eliminate it the night of. When there is an obligation to eat matzah, which is the night of the 15th, then there is an obligation not to have chametz, to eliminate the chametz. So why did Hashem write Ach Bayom Harishon? Ach Bayom Harishon is coming to add that you should know that you have to do tashbisu. You know when? Bayom Harishon. This Bayom Harishon does not mean the first day of Yom Tov. It means on the day prior to Yom Tov. Bayom Harishon means the day prior because of this proof. So now the Gemara is not done yet. I accept you, Abaya. This pasuk is only needed to add to the time of Tashbisu. But why are we saying that Midoi Raisa, the Ach Bayom Rishon, means that you have to eliminate it from the Midoi Raisa, from Sheishoi Sulamaylam? Why didn't you say you're adding a day, add a whole day? So one daf before we asked, why do you have to do B'dikas Chametz the night of the 14th? Do it 1 hour before the Zman Yisur Achila. Do it now. Now we're saying Pum Fakert. If the trade is adding, add a whole day. Why don't we say that Mido Oiraisa, you already have to burn your chametz the night of what we call the night of B'dikas Chametz? So the Gemara says that can't be because it says Ach Bayoim Harishoim, Bayoim Ksiv, and just like we said that Shivas Yomim, unless we prove it to mean otherwise, means the daytime of the day. Ach Bayoim Harishon means the daytime. But still, the Gemara says, if Ach Bayom Harishon is adding the day prior, should it not add the entire day prior? Why are we not obligated to burn the chametz? You have to burn it from the morning. So this answers the Gemara, no, that rule. Ach chilek. The word ach, like Rashi says 7-8 lines from the top of the Amid, achin, verakin, miutin. There are certain key words that either are inclusionary words or they are exclusionary words. The word ach is always limiting. So if the Torah would have meant that you have to eliminate your chametz on Erev, it would have said, Bayoim Harishon, perfect, Bayoim Harishon, Tashbisu Su'ar Mibatechem. Ach is God telling us you don't even have to eliminate it during the entire day, from the beginning. Some of the day you don't have to do Tashbisu, and from some of the day you do have to do it. And like Rashi writes over here, the Torah did not give a time. But once the Torah is telling us, some of the day you don't have to eliminate. The obligation, biblical obligation of eliminating begins in middle of the daytime of the day. It's a svara to say, if God did not say the hour, we should divide the day in half to make it fair. Half of the day, there's no chiyuv tashbisu. The chiyuv mido'iraisa of tashbisu begins in the second half. And that's the first proof we'll leave over here from Abaya to reconcile these two psukim should not be soised one the other and not adding information we have from the Hekish, enough knowledge for which the pasuk Ach Bayoim Harishon becomes superfluous. It must mean over here, like Rashi said the words, not on the first day, but Rishon means the day prior. Many other reasons, God willing, on Dafei Amadalev to be continued.
Good Shabbos, thank you.
So beautiful to see so many on the camera. Wow, beautiful.
Today I'm dressed.